My name is Susie, 59 years old. I'm just an ordinary senior who loves walking along the riverbank, visible from the levee every day. I used to have a husband until a few years ago. I met my husband David through my aunt's introduction. I had no interest in romance and continued to live single in the countryside even after my 30s. My aunt worried about me, kept bringing letters of introduction to different men. One of them was my husband. In today's world, not marrying is a choice, but back then, being single, especially in the countryside, meant receiving cold stares from the elderly. My father passed away early, and living with just my mother and me, the words, "You'll worry your parents," weighed heavily on me. Truth be told, I had no desire to marry, but I chose to marry my husband to ease my parents' worries. It was more about trust than love. He worked at a respectable company and was the second son of a well-known local confectioner. The other men introduced to me either came from different places or were too old, so we didn't really click. But I was naive back then. Around our 10th year of marriage, my husband suddenly asked me to start working. He had turned to gambling to escape work stress, and it seemed he had accumulated debts from his losses. Most of the money he brought home for living expenses was borrowed. I later found out that although he worked for a company, he was incompetent, the kind of employee who wouldn't be missed if he were gone. The eldest son, who didn't want to take over the family's confectionery, had been begged to do so my husband, the second son, wouldn't have to. My in-laws thought the business would fail if left to him. My husband was forgetful, sloppy at work, lacked consideration, and was unfit for customer service or behind-the-scenes work. Moreover, he was financially irresponsible and a big spender. He was disastrously inept at work, with an income barely higher than when he started. Still, he had a minimum income, and I had managed our household finances well until then. So I could remain a housewife until this point, but I was shocked to learn that our finances were sustained by debts. He apologized tearfully, promising to quit gambling. Seeing him like that, I believed if he quit gambling, and we both worked on repaying the debt, we'd be fine. A week after this conversation, I started working part-time at a nearby supermarket. My husband, working in a region with generally low wages, brought home about $1.2K, half of which went to debt repayment. That barely left enough for rent, utilities, and food. However, with my part-time income of $600 to $700, we managed the debt payments. I lived frugally, saving a bit each month, careful not to overspend, and learned to buy cheap groceries in bulk and freeze them. Then one day, I came home from work to find my husband had returned home early, a rarity. My husband has never come home earlier than me. Curious, "I'm home," I greeted him. Instead of a welcome, "Yeah," he just said. "Get dinner ready and prepare the bath," he ordered. All right, I replied, heading to prepare dinner and clean the bath. On the way, "We're out of coffee, by the way," he mentioned. I said, all right, then paused. If he was home first, couldn't he have at least done one of these tasks? Our coffee wasn't anything fancy, just cheap instant. The bath wasn't meticulously cleaned, and the meals, well, unlikely he could manage. I'd been a housewife before, and had continued to cater to his demands out of habit, but now, we were both working. Why was all the housework my responsibility? Once I realized this, even things I hadn't noticed before began to bother me. His clothes left on the floor, his anger when there's no toilet paper, his complaints about an unmade bed, all things he should be doing himself. Why did he act so superior? The more I thought about it, the more irritated I became, but I was too exhausted to say anything. It was rare for him to be home early, and it's understandable he didn't think to do anything himself. I decided to let it go for the day. However, that night at dinner, "This is terrible." He suddenly threw his fork and exclaimed. The sound of the fork clinking against the dishes echoed as if rolled away. "Every day, the meals are so plain, always minced meat, and even today,
after making me wait? What is this bland dish?
Today's menu was spaghetti bolognese, mashed potatoes, and carrot soup. Admittedly, it was a simple meal, but with no money for extravagance, I couldn't use many ingredients. Today's ingredients were all bought in bulk when cheap and frozen for later use. I had tried to make them into proper dishes. After all, it's not right to complain about a meal someone made for you. I'm sorry you didn't like the meal, but if you think you waited too long, I wish you'd help out with the housework a bit. I said this not in anger, but rather as a request.
I'm the man of this house. How can I do something so embarrassing?
My husband, raised in the countryside, saw housework as a woman's job, and it was strange for a man to do it. I couldn't say I didn't understand his point of view, as my mother and grandmother had always served their husbands in the same way. But I wish he would realize that the notion of housework being a woman's job is an outdated concept. Upset, he went to the bedroom, and I ended up eating alone, clearing the table and preparing the trash for the next day before finally going to sleep. A few days later, I returned home tired from work and heard lively voices inside. I live with my husband. It was unusual for our childless household. Wondering if there was a burglar, I cautiously opened the door to find my husband drinking happily with a man I didn't know.
Hey, Susie's back. This is my junior, William. Say hello.
My husband cheerfully introduced me to William, but I was more concerned about the array of dishes on the table. Fish meuniere, hamburgers, vegetable sticks, and potato salad. I didn't know for sure since I hadn't eaten, but where did the extravagant food and the abundance of alcohol come from?
Sorry, ma'am. David said it was okay, so I borrowed your kitchen.
William had cooked in place of my husband, who couldn't cook. Uh-huh. And the ingredients? I asked, suspecting the worst.
I let him use what was in the fridge. Don't sweat the small stuff.
And my husband retorted. William just smiled.
Excuse me.
Showing no real remorse since my husband had given permission. When I checked the fridge, indeed, the ingredients I had planned to use for this week, and probably next week too, were all gone. I was devastated. I had planned for almost no expenses this month with those ingredients. The electricity bill was due in a few days, including the air conditioning costs. I had wanted to save some money for emergencies. When I asked about the cost of the alcohol,
"Shut up. Of course I paid for it. I used the money from that bank account," he said.
That account was for emergencies, with money saved little by little from our daily expenses. We both might face unforeseen events or even life-threatening situations. That money was meant to be available immediately in such cases. It's also for each other. But my husband, not thinking of the future, couldn't understand that. Even though we're in our 40s, one can't always be healthy and energetic. I wish he'd feel embarrassed about not being able to entertain without dipping into that account. I hated how he drank happily with his junior, oblivious to my pain. That night, he did as he pleased, leaving empty cans around, and fell asleep in the living room without even seeing his junior off. He probably didn't care I stayed up late to see the junior off. I was left with my mind full of worries about money, having used the funds I had saved for emergencies. What if something happened now? Once this month's bills were paid, I'd have to worry about next month. And if I couldn't continue my part-time work, what would happen to our household? The anxiety was overwhelming. Oblivious to all this, the next morning,
"I want milk porridge with bread for breakfast. I drank too much,"
my husband said. There's no spare capacity in this house, yet I wonder how much they think bread costs. I've already spent money in ingredients, so I wish they'd at least say we'll skip breakfast. Skipping breakfast to go to my part-time job, my spirit gradually became rougher. Out of concern for our finances, I started working part-time at a supermarket and also at a pub. I secretly opened my own bank account without telling my husband and started pooling the money I earned from the pub there. Working day and night, my husband started to get irritated that I was neglecting the housework. However, I had become tougher lately, so I didn't just go along with what he said. "Why don't you do it yourself?" I thought it was because of him that things had gotten this way, and my feelings on the matter had only grown stronger. About half a year had passed since then. On that day, once again, my husband had gotten home before me. I didn't have good memories of this pattern, so I opened the door with a somewhat gloomy feeling. "I'm home."
Yeah.
Without even saying welcome back, my husband kept his back turned to me, yet his back somehow seemed smaller. I wondered what was wrong, why he seemed so down. Not liking the gloomy atmosphere at home, I tried to lighten the mood by asking about dinner and such. Then, in a quiet voice, my husband said something. "What?" I asked, not quite catching it.
"I got fired."
"What?" I couldn't help but let out a dismayed voice. It was almost surprising that he hadn't been fired until now. But why now, after all this time? "Why?" I asked.
"My boss complained because I forgot to report a big deal at work, complaining over such a small thing."
I genuinely couldn't understand what he meant. Wasn't it his fault for neglecting his duties and causing the company loss? It seemed only natural that he'd be fired. He had become not just a liability, but damage itself. And yet he didn't seem to think he was at fault in this situation. I had too much on my mind to put into words, so I just stayed silent. Seeing this, my husband must have thought I was shocked.
"But it's fine. This is like a new start. To celebrate, I got lobster and foie gras."
"What?" My voice was almost a scream. There was hardly any money left in the bank account I knew of. Where did he get the money from?
"What's with the noise? Excited for some luxury after a long time?"
"No, where did you get the money?" Before I could finish,
"I borrowed it, obviously,"
he replied. Unbelievable. He was the kind of person who would borrow money for such frivolous things. He had said he wouldn't borrow from financial companies again after getting hooked on gambling. Does that not include personal loans? Our values were so different. The man before me seemed like a foreigner speaking an unknown language. I felt dizzy. "Do you realize that money needs to be repaid?" I raised my voice, a mix of despair and irritation.
"Stop nagging. It's fine for once. It's like a ritual to attract good fortune, understand?"
If he wanted to attract good fortune, I wish he'd bring something that actually had a chance of attracting it. Not like this, in the face of unemployment. Stop it. Do you even understand why we're struggling financially? Your lack of social skills, your lack of planning. Just as I said that, I suddenly felt a severe dizziness.
"Whoa, what's wrong? Hey, don't die in this house. Call an ambulance."
Strange. This feels odd. I was being looked down upon by my husband as my consciousness faded.
"Absolutely not,"
I heard him repeatedly saying, wondering what he meant. Is this a dream? Maybe he's saying he doesn't want to repay the debt or live a frugal life. I wish it were all just a dream. When I next woke up, I was surrounded by white walls. My mother was looking into my face with worry. Her face quickly turned to tears. "Nurse!" And she shouted, "What's happening?" "Oh, thank goodness," she said, embracing me. Slowly, my consciousness became clearer, and I realized I was in a hospital room. What happened to me? "You collapsed at home from a heart attack. You even had surgery, and they said you might not wake up. I was so worried." My mother, still crying, hugged me even tighter. Her back and arms felt more frail than I remembered, and I felt sorry for causing her worry. It seems I had collapsed from a heart attack during an argument with my husband. The more I thought about it, the more my memories, along with my irritation, came back. The doctor said,
"Stress and fatigue might have contributed, so please don't dwell on that incident too much."
Apparently, my mother noticed alopecia areata on my head, which I hadn't realized myself. A little embarrassing. I was surprised to learn from the doctor that stress could cause a heart attack. Later, I heard that my husband refused to ride in the ambulance with me, saying,
"Being with a woman who's about to die will waste the good fortune I'm trying to attract."
I laughed, beyond understanding. No matter how hard he tried to attract good fortune, it wouldn't change anything if the person inside was beyond help. My mother kept asking worriedly,
Are you and David not getting along?
Not wanting to worry her. It's okay. It will all be over soon, I replied. Yes, it's time to end it. Falling like that made me realize I had been too shallow. Why hadn't I thought of divorce? Maybe because I married under pressure not to worry my parents. I thought divorce would sadden them. But seeing how worried my mother was about me collapsing, choosing my own health would surely make her happier. It's time to get ready. A month later, I finally got discharged from the hospital. My husband didn't even show up on the day I left. From the hospital, I went straight to the local family court and got a divorce application. After filling out the form, I returned home. Upon my return, without even asking if I was okay,
"Hey, make dinner,"
my husband said. With the biggest smile I could muster, I said, "Dinner it is."
"What?"
"Today's dinner. From today onwards, you're on your own. Please make it yourself." I said this, and my husband looked as if he couldn't understand. I knew he was incompetent at work, but now it seemed he couldn't even understand words. "I'm saying I want a divorce from a useless man like you."
"Huh? Did the hospital stay mess up your head?"
Ignoring his words, I went to the drawer and took out my banking card. This account contained money I earned at the pub and what I saved from the monthly household budget. He probably didn't know that this was what had been supporting us during tough times. From now on, live by yourself. I don't know how far your salary will take you, but it has nothing to do with me. You can send the response to the divorce papers to my parents' house. As I said this,
"Wait a minute. What are you going to do with that banking card?"
he shouted. He cared more about the money than the divorce. Disgusting until the end. "What do you mean? This is my money. You know we've been living off my savings for a month since you got fired. That money was saved from your salary, but this bank account contains savings from my salary. It's rightfully my property, so I'm taking it."
"Hey, don't joke around. Leave the money."
Ignoring his voice, I left the house and got into the taxi I had waiting.
"Wait, stop joking. That's mine."
In a panic, wearing sandals, he chased after the taxi. A fitting retribution. He should know the struggles I went through living in poverty. It was then that his voice echoed. Looking back, he was nowhere to be seen. "Driver, sorry, can you stop for a moment?" I asked and got out of the taxi. It was a beautiful riverbank that blossoms with flowers in the spring. But just before the riverbank, something dirty caught my eye.
"Ow, it hurts. Help me, somebody."
"Oh, it's my husband." Well, he's supposed to become a stranger, so he's just some acquaintance now. It seemed he had tripped while running and rolled down the embankment. That's what happens when someone who doesn't exercise properly runs in sandals. He saw me.
"Susie, call an ambulance! Call an ambulance!"
and shouted. I just stood there doing nothing, but someone out for a walk noticed and called an ambulance. Thinking this might get interesting, I approached him. "Does it hurt?"
"Of course it does. It's your fault. Why am I in this situation?"
Maybe it's the pain of my heart returning to you. A fitting retribution, perhaps." I answered, smiling. His anger reached its peak.
"You?"
He tried to hit me, but apparently he had broken something.
"Ow!"
I couldn't do anything but scream. The ambulance arrived promptly. My husband shouted to the paramedics.
"There's my wife. Take her with me."
The paramedics asked me,
"Are you his wife?"
I made it clear to them and said, "No, I don't know this person."
Despite that, "Don't joke around. She's my wife."
As my husband kept yelling, I thought I couldn't escape and resigned myself. "I'm his wife, but we're planning to divorce, so I don't want to be involved." The paramedics looked at me and my husband alternately, perplexed, then asked me apologetically,
"Can you accompany him to the hospital?"
I answered without hesitation, "Absolutely not." My husband screamed shrilly,
"Have you forgotten all the good I've done for you?"
"Good? There's no favor in a man who can't even prepare a single roll of toilet paper and makes life hard with his debts." I said this, and the paramedics looked at my husband with cold eyes, realizing what kind of person he was.
"Shut up. Just get in the ambulance. How long do I have to lie here in pain?"
Typical foolish husband. He still didn't understand my words. I'll say it again. I'm divorcing you. Please take care of yourself from now on, including your finances. After I said that, the paramedics gave up persuading me and began preparing to leave. My husband was the only one making noise. Oh, by the way, I paid for my own hospital bills, so please pay yours. I doubt there's even $50 left in your bank account, though. I said this with a laugh and returned to the taxi. Later, my husband sent several requests for reconciliation, but I ignored them all, and eventually he seemed to give in and sent the response to the divorce papers. He wanted reconciliation for a reason. He was forced to declare bankruptcy and seemed to want me back as a breadwinner. Eventually, his embarrassed in-laws got to know about the situation and convinced him to stop his shameful behavior. Now, my ex-husband is working multiple part-time jobs. I didn't make a fortune using some unique talent, nothing like that. I just lead an ordinary life, sometimes walking along the embankment where my husband fell and laughing when I remember it. I volunteer for children's storytime sessions on this embankment and participate as a reader. As a result, many of the local children recognize me and often ask me to play with them. Now this place is a haven for me. After the divorce, I went back to my mother's house, but eventually returned to my original place, still visiting my mother regularly. Marriage was not an act of filial piety. Seeing my mother like this is the best way I can honor her. I should have realized this sooner. This ordinary life might not be special, but I now cherish it, knowing what it's like to live in constant stress. I plan to live my life treasuring myself, my mother, and the local children. Today, the sky and the sunset seen from the embankment are beautiful. It's wonderful to be alive and healthy.